What is a redress of grievances? Essentially, a redress of grievances is where you or me or a people in general go to authority, an authoritative body, in this case, with what we're studying, the King of England, and say, I have a redress of grievances. I have a bone to pick with you. I have a problem with what you're doing, and I would like to redress these grievances. I would like to put it down on paper so you know I'm not happy with what you're doing, and if you don't change it, I may have to take certain actions. A redress of grievances is where you let someone know you have a problem with what they are doing, or as my late grandmother used to say, a bone to pick with you. Well, today we're going to learn about a redress of grievances from the American colonist to the King of England. Now, we've reviewed everything that happened with the American Revolution. I mean, maybe not everything, because there's a lot, but we've touched base on a lot, right? It starts out with the Sugar Act, right? You had the French and Indian War, where the American colonists and England were on the same team. They were friends, everything was fine and dandy, right? The American colonists were actually subject of the King of England, so they were part of England. And the French and Indian War, so the American colonists in England, they get in this war against the French and other Indian tribes, and they win the war. The colonists, England, they win the war, kumbaya, everything is all good, and one little issue, the war cost a lot of money, because the King of England had to borrow a bunch of money from who? The banks. The banks are extremely important when it comes to war. So after the war, the King of England had to pay back the banks, and he said, oh, don't worry about it. I'll just tax the colonists, and the colonists will pay for the war. And the American colonists said, no, King George III, this was your war. You wanted this. You pay for the war. Well, let the conflict begin. Let the building of grievances begin. Because it started with the Sugar Act in 1764. So the French and Indian War ends in 1763, and 1 year later, 1764, boom, the King of England comes in and says, oh, don't worry, we'll do the Sugar Act, and through taxation of sugar and molasses, along with some other goods, we will raise the money we need to pay back the bank. Well, the colonists, obviously, as we've studied, didn't like this at all. And they would protest, and they would march in the street with their signs and say, no taxation without representation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But they were airing out their grievances in protest, saying, you know what, this Sugar Act, not fair. They did all types of things we hadn't discussed yet. They actually, that's not a real man, by the way, that's an effigy. But in protest, one of the things that the colonists did is they made, it's like a big doll, right, an effigy. It's like a human-sized doll of, you know how it's all about taxation, right? Of the tax collector. And they put this doll out in public, and they pretended to kill the doll, right? So this was just a protest. They were saying that this is how angry we are, we're not happy, and we're letting you know about it. So they were marching with their signs and burning effigies, which is quite threatening if you're a tax collector. I mean, imagine it's your job. You just read a letter, and it said, hey, Mr. Tax Collector, this is a letter from the King of England, and we're doing this tax on sugar, and you have to go collect money from everyone, right? And then you walk outside, and they have a doll with your name on it, and they have it hung up on a tree, and they're lighting it on fire. That's scary stuff, right? Well, the colonists were in full protest, and the conflict was escalating quickly, and we'll cover other things that we've discussed previously. So 1765, the king says, no nonsense, all right. He throws out the Sugar Act because of the protest, but he says, all right, Stamp Act. You'll just pay a tax on stamps, right? Every piece of paper that you get has to come from a company in England with this special stamp on it. So if you want to send a letter, you need that stamp. If you want paperwork for your business, you have to pay for that stamp, right? Well, the colonists weren't happy. And again, they would chant, no taxation without representation. Now, what does this mean? For one, we have to understand taxation, and for two, we have to understand representation. Taxation, right, is just when the government takes a little bit of your money and uses it, in theory, to pay for services. In this case, they're going to take a little bit of money every time you send some paperwork. You're just going to have to give the government a little bit of money, and they'll use that money to pay for the French and Indian War, to pay back the bank. Taxation. Representation, right? We have to understand taxation and representation. Representation means, do you get a vote, right? Do you have any say in if there will be taxes and how much the taxes will be? And the colonists, they chanted in the street, no taxation without representation, because they didn't get a vote, right? The king didn't say, okay, colonists, you can have one of your representatives come to England and vote on this taxation situation, right? Join it was called their parliament. So you could have one of your people come and join our English parliament and help us decide if there should be taxes, two, how much the taxes should be. The colonists didn't have that. So they said, no taxation without representation. No Sugar Act, no Stamp Act, no any acts. Well, the king didn't stop there. So the colonists, they were boycotting. They were refusing to buy anything that comes from England. They were protesting in the street with their signs, chanting, no taxation without representation. They were burning effigies of tax collectors, right? These big human dolls. They were hanging them up on trees and burning them. The colonists were defiant, right? They were not exactly listening to what the king said. So he says, you know what? I'm going to send my English troops to the colonies. And he filled the colonies with these soldiers, right? The military. And he passed the Quartering Act and said, you know, I don't want to have to pay for room and board. I don't want to have to pay for my soldiers to sleep in a bed at night. You know what? You house them. The Quartering Act. And if they show up at your house and knock on your door, I'm saying by law, this is the King of England, right? The King of England said, by law, you have to let that soldier into your house, sleep in your bed, and you have to feed them food. How would you have felt about the king? And put on another pair of shoes and think, how would you feel if you were the king and you just spent all of this money or borrowed all of this money from the bank to fight a war to, in your mind, protect the colonists, and now the colonists don't want to pay for it? There's two sides to every story. And as you get older, you're going to have to read, and some of you already should be reading primary documents and the original writings of the Founding Fathers and the King of England, and that's something we'll focus on as we move forward. But the colonists, they continued to protest. No taxation without representation. No taxation without representation. Let's go burn an effigy of a tax collector. Not a real man, but a doll that has his name written across the doll's chest, right? They are protesting and they are boycotting, right? We talked about some of their boycotts. We'll talk about the boycott again in a little bit, where they took the tea, right? They boarded a ship dressed as Indians. They took tea and they threw it into the Boston Harbor. Well, that wasn't their only boycott. They refused to buy pretty much anything from England. If it came from England, they weren't buying it. And it got so bad with their boycotts, or good from the perspective of the people doing the boycott, the American colonists, that the businesses in England went to the king and said, please stop taxing the colonists. They're not buying anything from us. I know you're trying to raise money through the taxes, but you must be losing money because the colonists are boycotting everything. And the reason the colonists were able to do that so effectively is the way they lived their life. Your freedom does not come from a king. Freedom does not come from a president. Your freedom does not come from Congress or the people that make the laws. Your freedom comes from the manner through which you live your life. And as you get older and freedom becomes more and more important to you, you'll discover that the few people that ever truly taste freedom, that ever truly understand freedom, are the ones that make it a lifestyle, like these colonists did, because they cut their own wood, they cut down trees, right? They milled their own wood, they built their own log cabins, their own homes, they grew their own wheat and made their own bread. They took care of their livestock, their cows, their pigs, their chickens. They had eggs and milk, and they turned that milk into butter, and they sold that butter to one another. Or they traded, bartering. They said, hey, I'll give you this butter that I just made using the milk from my cow, and I'll trade it to you for some chicken eggs. Can we do that? And, oh, sure, you have a deal. That's called bartering, right? Taking care of one another. There are many different forms of currency. Don't ever let anyone convince you that money is the only form of currency. Those chicken eggs are very valuable. That cow milk is very valuable. The way in which you carry yourself through life is very valuable, because if you're a good guy or a good girl and you treat others with respect and love thy neighbor, then those neighbors are likely to help you out when you need help in life. There are many different forms of currency, and the colonists had that. They had something that was called rugged individualism, where they were independent people who cut down trees and milled their own wood and built their own cabins and took care of their cows and took care of their chickens and made milk into butter and made their own clothing and made their own shoes and did their own welding, and they were blacksmiths and they could make things out of metal. These were incredibly capable, rugged individualists, and they were based in community, and it was largely Christian community. So they were capable and they were together, and because of that, they were very effective in their boycotts. They were very effective in their protests. They were very effective at airing out a redress of their grievances, but we're going to talk more about that. Well, 1767 comes, and the King of England and the English Parliament, who make the laws, which the American colonists had no say in, no representation. They said, no taxation without representation. Well, they implemented the Townsend Acts, and it was a tax on glass and lead and paper and paint and tea. This was the start of the Tea Act, 1767. Well, the colonists, they would continue to boycott, and they smuggled illegal tea in from other countries, right? John Hancock had a boat, and he would take that boat to other countries, pick up tea, and bring it back to the American colonies. The colonists were not going down without a fight. Well, 3 years later, 1770, you had that drunk guy walks into a bar, he insults an English soldier, the soldier calls him a bloody Yankee. Next thing you know, the soldier hits him over the head with a gun. The people get angry about this. A mob of angry American colonists form around that soldier. His buddies come to help him out. There's 8 English soldiers surrounded by an angry mob of American colonists. They're throwing snowballs at the soldiers. They are throwing ice at the soldiers. They are hitting them with sticks. And the English soldiers get scared and open fire. Boston Massacre. 3 people dead, 5 more shot. Right? Not good. Not good. Tensions are rising. Well, you have the Tea Act, and in 1773, the American colonists in Boston, Massachusetts, they dress up as Native Americans or Indians. They sneak onto a ship filled with tea, and they throw over $1 million worth of tea in today's money into Boston Harbor. Well, that pissed the king off. He said, you throw my tea into the water. You waste all of my money when I'm trying to pay for the French and Indian War. The Intolerable Acts. And the Intolerable Acts, basically he said, listen, if you're in Massachusetts, you have no say over anything. You're not allowed to meet up with one another. That's it. I'm shutting it down. He puts a ton of soldiers in Massachusetts. He puts naval ships in Boston Harbor, and he actually does a blockade where he has so many naval ships that he could prevent people like John Hancock who were trying to smuggle tea. He said, no, you're not doing that anymore. We're shutting that down. Well, after the Intolerable Acts, the rebellion spread, right? It wasn't just Boston, Massachusetts. All of a sudden, everyone, I mean, not all of a sudden, but everyone was really taking note. New York, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, right? Everyone was taking note. And the 13 colonies would have a meeting in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at a place that's now known as Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And this was called the First Continental Congress. And they got together because they wanted to write down a redress of grievances. Put a redress of grievances in words. This is a map, and if you're looking at the map, you could see the big yellow state is New York. And right under the big yellow state is the green state, and that is Pennsylvania. That's where the meeting was, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Right? And right under Pennsylvania, you could see that big purple state, Virginia. So Pennsylvania is in a New York-Virginia sandwich, right? They got New York on top, Virginia below them, and then you got Pennsylvania right there in the green. And that's where Independence Hall is, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and that's where the First Continental Congress took place. So the First Continental Congress wanted to do a redress of their grievances. They wanted to put down in writing for the king and say, these are our grievances. This is the problem we have with what you're doing, and we expect you to change it. So they created a document, a piece of paperwork, right? They got some paper, and they wrote on the paper. They created this document, and they called it the Declaration of Resolves. They wrote down the Declaration of Resolves. This was in 1774, after first there was the Boston Tea Party. The king responds with the Intolerable Acts, where he tells the people in Massachusetts they're not even allowed to have meetings anymore. So they meet up at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Independence Hall. And they have a redress of their grievances. They write up the Declaration of Resolves at the First Continental Congress in October of 1774. And in the Declaration of Resolves, they put down on paper that they have a right to life, liberty, and property. Life, liberty, and property. What is property? I went to the store and I bought this book, right? So when I handed the money to the person at the store and I got this book became part of my property. So if someone else comes and takes this book from me, that would be considered stealing, and it's against the law, right? Life, liberty, and property. That can include a house, that can include your shirt, right? But property. They said in the Declaration of Resolves, we have a right to life, liberty, and property. That no taxation without representation is a violation of our rights. And they expect the king to either give them representation in Parliament or to withdraw all taxation. No taxation without representation has to end. They say in the Declaration of Resolves that they have the same rights as their grandparents did, right? Because their grandparents, years before this, were living in England. And they got on a boat and they traveled all the way across the ocean from England to America. So the colonists in the Declaration of Resolve said, when our grandparents came to America, they never gave up any of their rights. So because of that, because we have the same rights as our grandparents, we are protected by English common law. Common law. We are going to learn a lot about common law as you guys get older. But basically, they're saying we have the same rights as our grandparents, and because of that, we are protected by English common law. And that the military occupation of the American colonies is illegal. They said, you have to take all of your soldiers and get them out of the American colonies because this is an illegal military occupation and it must end. So they said in the Declaration of Resolves, they looked at the king and said, this is a redress of our grievances. We are entitled to life, liberty, and property. We will not tolerate no taxation without representation. We have the same rights as our grandparents did when they left England through inheritance. Inheritance is very important. We have inherited the same rights that our grandparents had. And because of that, we are protected by English common law. And the military occupation, the soldiers, the English soldiers that are in Boston, Massachusetts, in the American colonies, there's no justification for them being here. They have to go. Well, they also did a few other things. They continued to protest, and they actually, they really strengthened their boycotts. They said, listen, we need to communicate with all of the people here and say we need to boycott. And in preparation that maybe it might not go so well, there could be a fight, they started to form militias all over the American colonies. Now, militias are people like you and I who partner with one another, right? They group up, they get firearms, they get their guns, and they say, listen, if something happens, we will essentially operate as a military unit, right? These militias. But it's of the people rather than of the government. Patrick Henry, someone we'll learn more about, would give a very famous speech at this time because there's a lot of uncertainty. Are we about to have a war with the most powerful army in the world in England? Well, Patrick Henry thought it should come to that. And he gave a very famous speech in 1774, which ultimately convinced the people in Virginia to form a militia and really to get ready for what could be a war. And in that speech, he ended it with a very famous line in which he said, "Give me liberty or give me death. Give me liberty or give me death." That to Patrick Henry, he thought the risk of dying in a war was worth it for the rights that he believes that he was born with, that he has, right? For life, liberty, and property. For no taxation without representation. For the inheritance of the rights of his grandfather from English common law. The King of England didn't take well to any of this, and he said, oh yeah? He sent even more English troops, soldiers, military. He sent the English military, he said, you go and you put these colonists in line. So he sends more military, and then he has an idea. Middle of the night in 1775, he's going to send the English soldiers to sneakily take away all of the guns of the colonists as they sleep. So he sends the soldiers to Lexington and Concord. But Paul Revere sees them coming, and he hops on his horse. The British are coming! The British are coming! Hey, Paul, what are the British coming for? To take the guns! The British are coming to take the guns! The British are coming to take the guns! And to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Well, when the English soldiers arrived at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, the American colonists were there waiting. And the English soldiers said, surrender your guns. And the colonists weren't having that, and they opened fire. Someone opened fire. The shot heard around the world. And that was the start of the American Revolution. And the American Revolution started in April of 1775, and weeks later, in May of 1775, keep in mind, there's no telephones at this time, right? There's no internet, no computers. So this happening weeks later, it happened very quickly, right? This was handwritten letters not delivered by cars, but by horses, right? Horses take a lot longer to travel. So a few weeks later, the Second Continental Congress convenes in Pennsylvania, Independence Hall. And at the Second Continental Congress, they still, even though there's fighting going on, the American Revolution started. They are having battles, right? They're shooting and killing each other. The American colonists and the English soldiers and army, right? They're having full-out war battles. And the colonists, they still want to be part of England, at least some of them. So they write up another redress of their grievances. They say, we have more grievances. Let's just do a redress of grievances. Send this to the king, right? We'll write down our grievances. We'll write down our problems with what he has done, and the king will understand, and this will all come to an end. So in July of 1775, the Continental Congress, they created the Olive Branch Petition. This was another redress of their grievances. In the petition, they told the king, listen, we're still loyal to you, and let's just end these hostilities. Well, the king, he slammed the door shut on reconciliation, and he declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. The American Revolution was on. So, the Second Continental Congress wrote up a declaration of the causes and necessity of taking up arms. And in that, they talk about many of the same things. No taxation without representation, life, liberty, and property, the military occupation of the colonies. So the Second Continental Congress creates the Continental Army, an actual army, not just militias. And they put George Washington in charge. They say George Washington is going to be the general of the Continental Army. Many of you probably know George Washington would go on to become the first president of the United States of America under the American Constitution. Now, there is a little bit of history before that happens, but we'll get into that later. But he would ultimately, the general of the Continental Army, would later become the first president. And on June 7th, 1776, so this is a little while after. I mean, we're going from July 1775 to almost a year later. They've been fighting. They've been having this war. You get the Lee Resolution. And in the Lee Resolution, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia puts forward a document in which he says, this isn't working out and we need to declare that we're independent and free from the British colonies. And that gets passed. And on July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence is written. And we're going to start next class talking about the Declaration of Independence, because it's the ultimate redress of grievances. And the Declaration of Independence really states where our rights come from, and it is probably more important, or just as important, as this Bill of Rights, right? In fact, it's probably more important than the Declaration of Independence. And we're going to talk about it next week. So, the colonists redressed their grievances. They did their boycotts. They did their petitions. They got together at the First Continental Congress, the Declaration of Resolves, life, liberty, and property, no taxation without representation, same rights as grandparents, we have the protection of English common law, and the military occupation of the American colonies needs to end. Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. Well, the Second Continental Congress, they put out the Olive Branch Petition. They say, listen, we still have these grievances, but let's end the fighting, give us some representation in Congress, end the taxation. Doesn't happen. You get the Lee Resolution, Declaration of Independence. We're going to talk about next week. And then, of course, years later, after they win the war, after the American colonists win the war, they create the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. To petition the government. for a redress of grievances. Here's what I want you to think about this week. After everything the colonists had gone through, the First Continental Congress, after everything they had gone through, let's go over it. The First Continental Congress, the Declaration of Resolves, the Second Continental Congress, the Olive Branch Petition, the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, the Lee Resolution, and the Declaration of Independence. Why do you think they thought it was so important that in the First Amendment to protect our rights, the Founding Fathers put in that the government shall not restrict the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances? All right, guys. It's been a lot of fun. Talk to you next week.